Hi, welcome to the Week 9 Forum. This week we are looking at emerging terrorist environments. By that, Martin is referring to political violence that is specifically targeting gender, both male and female, and then also criminal dissident terrorism and the connection between these groups and criminal groups. So this nexus between criminal and dissident terrorist groups. I mentioned in the overview for this week the treatment of women, non-Sunnis, by members of the Islamic State, above and beyond the fact that ISIS employed a deranged interpretation of the Quran and Sharia law to justify beheadings and other draconian behaviors. ISIS also clearly, reinstituted and opened slave markets. They were particularly harsh towards the Yazidi, which is a religious enclave in Iraq with an ancient, lineage going back to Zoroastrianism. Why do you think they were so savage towards the Yazidi in particular? What explanations does Martin offer for gender-specific violence? To what extent are these kinds of behaviors a traditional feature of warfare, or at least warfare, as practiced prior to the establishment of international laws of war? Martin offers 5 examples of 20th century gender-selective terrorism against men. Are there any unifying factors when you look at those, those events that he's describing, or the context that explain them? I'm not saying are these actions rational or defensible, but rather is there a common context within which this kind of mass violence makes sense, against males? Another important illustration of male selective terrorism occurred in the early 1990s, again during the dissolution of Yugoslavia, which resulted in a brutal 3-way civil war between ethnic Croats, Bosnians and Serbs. The term ethnic cleansing kind of arose within academia during this period, and journalism, I think. What does that ethnic cleansing means? Which side of that particular conflict were the cleansers, if you will? Which ethnic groups or groups were the ones being cleansed? What role did ethnicity and religion play in the remorseless nature of that conflict? I also happen to think that ethnic cleansing typically has a female component as well. Militias responsible for ethnic cleansing in Kosovo, for example, they kill all the males and the boys, but they'd also rape all the women in an act that I would characterize as attempted cultural annihilation. What do you think about that? When it comes to explaining gender-specific terrorism against women, the 2 cases Martin cites are both Islamic in nature. Saudi Arabia's suppression of women through the Mutawin, who are also known as the Authority for the Promotion of Virtue and Prevention of Vice, and the vicious suppression of Afghan women during Taliban's regime. Why do you suppose conservative Muslim regimes are so oppressive towards women? What political goals are being furthered by denying women fundamental rights and dignity? Lest we succumb to the temptation to think that Muslims are the only ones that practice cultural suppression of women, what other cultures does Martin cite in terms of practicing kind of culturally normed violence against women? I think one country that recently has had a terrible run of gang rapes, for example, is India. This phenomenon began widely, being reported in 2014. Why is India experiencing such an upsurge in sexual violence against women? I've seen some accounts that suggest, well, there's a serious gender imbalance. There's more men than women in India, and that means that men are being denied, access to sex. But to me, the emergence of this kind of rape culture is not really explained that way, because China has a very similar gender imbalance, but they don't have these, widely reported and frequently occurring incidents of gang rape. Is this phenomenon similar to similar to the other sorts of things that we're reading about this week? I'll post some articles, and we can talk about it within the framework of the forum. I like that Martin takes the time to recognize that terrorism directed at women is not a new thing. It is something, however, that academics study of female-targeted terrorism is somewhat nascent. In terms of establishment female-targeted terrorism, Martin offers the rape of Nanking that was executed by the Japanese Imperial Army in October and December of 1937 as an example. He also cites Bangladesh's War of Independence against Pakistan in 1971, where West Pakistani troops engaged in systematic rape and murder of Bengali women. Upwards of 3 million Bengalis died before India intervened and expelled West Pakistani military forces from what would then become Bangladesh. Why do these two examples stand out as illustrations of establishment female-targeted terrorism? To what extent do these examples demonstrate that female-targeted terrorism is often occasioned also by mass killings of males as well? Has rape always been one element of the brutal spoils of war, at least until very recently? And again, it still persists in areas where you have these civil wars where norms just tend to break down. Dissident terrorism against women has a similar ring to it, in which insurgents groups are, again, systematically killing men and boys and then systematically raping women and girls, which is the ultimate act in a way of objectification, right? Using women's bodies in pursuit of cultural obliteration. Again, any thoughts you might have on that, I'd appreciate sharing with the class. Martin references the ethnic cleansing that took place in the dissolution of Yugoslavia, and he also mentions the brutality that occurred during the 11-year civil war in Sierra Leone, which finally ended in 2002. If you aren't aware geographically where Sierra Leone is, it's a former British Crown colony in West Africa, which is situated above what is known as the Gulf of Benin, which is that point where the African continent begins a very steep inward curve towards Nigeria. Political instability in Liberia contributed to the destabilization of the one-party regime in Sierra Leone, again, which resulted in 11 years of mounting atrocities in a bloody civil war, which got so bad that the United Kingdom finally intervened in an operation called Operation Palliser, and the British military units there exceeded their stabilization mandate and actually just went ahead and just defeated the Armed Forces Revolutionary Council, which was the rebel group that was, the war caused over 50,000 deaths. It produced 2 million displacements and a long list of horrific atrocities in which rebels took to chopping off hands, arms, and legs of anyone that resisted them. And where the taking of what they call bushwives, young women who were compelled to become sexual slaves of rebel soldiers, became commonplace. And there are echoes of this in what you're seeing with Boko Haram today. The one group was Christian, Boko Haram, of course, is Muslim. But there are regional affinities, and obviously I think that what's happening there is very similar. I think that there are connections. The other example Martin uses is, again, drawn from Africa, in this case, the Civil War that resulted in the partition of Sudan into two countries. Featured prominently again in that civil war were the Janjaweed, who, they were Muslim Arab, what they called men on horseback, who again engaged in systematic ethnic cleansing in the Darfur region. And this again was an instance where you had people who were only nominally associated with the government who were, basically just engaging in savagery. As you look at these cases of establishment and dissident, gender-specific terrorism, what are some of the common features that helped precipitate these horrors? Think about, kind of draw up a list of the commonalities. You have things like ethno-nationalist and religious conflict, weak or corrupt central governments, the result of civil war, or resulting in civil war, and the breaking of norms that keep people, that ordinarily would prevent people from killing one another. Let's share what we're thinking about, and let's work towards a working explanation for why these kinds of events happen. The second part of the chapter deals with the increasingly symbiotic relationship between criminal gangs and terrorist groups. I think this section is straightforward, but it's not to say it's necessarily easy to understand. For our purposes, think about the incentives that terrorist groups have to create relationships with organized crimes. What does the one side have that the other needs? What resources and motivations do they share that can be met by working together? And what challenges are raised when two otherwise disparate, kind of groups of bad people? What kind of challenges are presented to governments in general and to law enforcement in particular in responding to those kinds of challenges? Responding to the challenges of that kind of violence. One other point to consider in this section on the nexus between criminal and terrorist groups is the role of geography. As James C. Scott has pointed out, civilization can't climb. In shorthand, that basically means that difficult terrain, be it mountains or very hilly territory or swampy territory or desert terrain, they present difficulties for governments in projecting power and controlling that territory. And as nature abhors a vacuum, the people who don't want to be governed often gravitate into those places. And a lot of times those folks are not people that are nice people. Smugglers, organized crime, the places that Martin mentions as hotspots for these kinds of criminal terrorists hookups, the Bekaa Valley, the Tri-Border region, the poppy fields of Afghanistan. These are difficult to govern regions that have well-established connection to, criminal activity. So this should be enough to get you started. What aspect of this chapter challenged your previous understanding of terrorism? What did you learn this week that you didn't already know? What's your most important takeaway for this week? Let me hear from you.